This is a kind of catch-all chapter, chapter 29. What's going on in this chapter? They're bringing together a couple different groups that are not actually, they're not directly connected with each other, what we would say genetically, like one of them springing off of the other. They're coming out of a common problematic, a common cultural situation. And they all represent new religious movements that become new denominations, new churches. So they've started talking first about sort of big picture themes with this. And they say two themes have especially dominated the quest for the meaning of America. Bless you. Limitless space and new beginnings in time. You have to do a bit of imaginary work in order to make this click for you. Because I don't think that these are themes that we currently feel are central in our lives. How many of you feel like you could pick up anytime and just go somewhere else, start over, new? Those opportunities don't really exist like they used to, do they? Why not? I mean, you guys are all in school right now, but let's say you got your degree in hand. Can you just go anywhere you want? Right, as they say, write your ticket. There's no frontier for you to go out to, is there? And get your 40 acres by cultivating it. What's the job market like right now for you guys? Yeah, it's a good way to describe it. We probably use all sorts of swear words for it. Is it likely to get better by the time that you graduate? Do you feel like you have a lot of opportunities to just pick up and completely start over again? It could be that this part of the American experience is something that's harder for you guys to relate to, harder for me to relate to as well, than it was for earlier Americans. So you have to do a little bit of imagining, a little bit of sort of, putting yourself out on the frontier where there were a lot of more opportunities, where you could actually start over again, with a new beginning in time. You want to put yourself in that mindset. They talk about certain times and places as being especially susceptible to the rise of cultural trends and new religious movements. So they use the example of California, which you might not associate with religion at this time, but there's a lot of new movements as we go further in the book that are going to come out of California, including one of the branches of Pentecostalism. The New England area, we've already seen a number of different things coming out of there. Two other places that they talk about in this time period that are really important are Kentucky and New York. In New York, they talk about the burned over district. Why is it called the burned over district? Because there were so many revivals that, everyone's lighting a new fire. Pretty soon that entire upstate region has been metaphorically burned over by all these new ways of looking at things. And some of the other groups that we're going to look at are going to come out of there. Kentucky, why is Kentucky important? You don't really associate Kentucky with new ideas in terms of religion and culture these days. It's seen as a conservative area, isn't it? But at the time, that was the frontier. And all these people were pouring through the Cumberland Gap in the mountains into this broad area, getting away from the cities, getting away from previous ways of doing things. And there were a lot of revivals taking place in Kentucky. Your book talks about one of the great revivals was the Cane Ridge revival in Bourbon County, Kentucky. Bourbon County is, where a lot of bourbon comes from. So if you ever go on the Bourbon Trail, that's one of the places to go to. But at that time, what we're looking at is revivals in religion. And this guy, Stone, Barton Warren Stone, he's associated with what we're going to call the Christian Restorationist. Restoration movement. And this is in the, early, mid 1800s. Don't mix this up, by the way, with Christian Reconstructionist movement, which is a much later movement that takes place, which is associated with the far right. These guys are coming together from a couple different places. You have this guy, Barton Stone, who starts out being a Presbyterian and then gets kicked out. Why does he get kicked out? Well, because he's too revivalist. He's too much into this emotional type of spirituality, and the Presbyterians back east say we're not for that, and so they have to split ways. Along with this goes another guy, Thomas Campbell. And he's coming originally out of Northern Ireland, Ulster. Emigrates to Pennsylvania, gets in trouble with his co-religionists there, and forms a new group called the Christian Association. And they're doing things very similar to Stone. And then we have another guy, Walter Scott. And he joins forces with this guy Alexander, Alexander Campbell in a bit. And all these groups are doing the same sort of thing. They all have the same basic emphasis. Back to original Christianity. They wanted to end the divisions. Because think about this. If you were a Christian at the time that we're talking about, the next thing that somebody would ask you is, well, what kind of Christian? Are you Baptist? Are you Methodist? Are you Anglican? Episcopalian? Are you Unitarian? Are you a Congregationalist? And, at a certain point you want to say, look, I'm just a Christian. Those are just denominations. Those are just sort of external forms. Why are we so divided? Why, if we're all supposed to be Christians, Christians are actually supposed to be in unity. Isn't that a sign that somebody's getting it right, that they can all be on the same page? The original Christian church wasn't a whole bunch of different churches like Baptists and Presbyterians and Lutherans, was it? If you read the book of Acts, does it mention any of those groups? Not really. So they want to get back to original Christianity. What's the blueprint for that then? How would you do that? If that was your goal right now, if you said, we're going to begin anew, wipe the slate clean, got to get away from all these churches. By now there's actually over 10,000 different denominations, if you want to get really technical about it, in the United States. Christian denominations. That's an awful lot, isn't it? So let's say you say, wipe all this stuff away. We're going to begin again. What do you begin with?
Bible.
Very good. Start with the Bible as the sole source. Have we heard this before?
Protestant.
Yeah, the very beginnings of the Protestant Reformation is sola scriptura, the Bible alone. So what we're seeing is sort of like a new reformation of the Reformation occurring. This is a theme that we see over and over again in American history. The new beginnings are it's not Expo beginnings, right?
1 June.
Jeez. If I get words wrong, let me know if you see it up there, okay? The new beginnings aren't always so new. Oftentimes they're a repetition of some other previous theme, and that's what's happening with this. Like your book says, one of their key mottos is, where the scriptures speak, we speak. Where the scriptures are silent, we're silent. And their view was, you can find everything that you need in the Bible. They were not particularly, like your book points out, emotional. They're not like the Great Awakening churches, like Baptist churches or Methodist churches. They're much more rationalistic in tone. Their view is that, well, if you just apply yourself to studying the Bible, you'll figure out what Christian life ought to look like, what Christian community ought to look like, and you can thereby follow what the scriptures teach you and improve the world. They're post-millennial in that sense. And they give rise to one big church movement, the Restorationist movement. They call themselves by a couple different names. This is one of the early ones, Disciples of Christ. Here's another one, Churches of Christ. And then some of them will just call themselves Christians. And they'll say, we're the Christian church. And these two terms, Disciples of Christ and Churches of Christ, end up becoming the names for some of the denominations that arise from them. It's kind of an irony, right? Because these guys are all about overcoming denominations. After a while, they end up splitting. You know, it's very hard to get everybody to agree completely about the Bible and what it teaches. As we saw earlier with the Protestant Reformation, right? Different groups go different ways. Disciples of Christ are the more urban-centered one. They're one of the large churches here in the United States today. The two different groups that go by the term Churches of Christ, large presence in Indiana, but not a large presence nationwide. They're sort of shrinking a bit. And some of them are so conservative as to not even allow organs in the church, because do you find any organs in the Bible? Nope. So shouldn't have those. That's where this group comes from, the Restorationist movement. The Disciples of Christ really end up more or less fitting into the Protestant mainstream, and but that's their origin. Now, another one of the key developments that's going to take place is what we call Millennialism. I don't know if that's spelled right, but I don't know if any of you know if it's spelled right either. And this is Premillennialism. Sometimes this gets called Adventism. So premillennialism, as opposed to postmillennialism, which we've already talked about, premillennialism is this view that the second coming of Christ is going to happen prior to the millennium, prior to the 1,000 years where everything is great. So usually associated with this tends to be things like the notion of the rapture, right? That people are going to get drawn up into heaven, which is, if I remember it, coming from Paul's letters to the Thessalonians, sort of an interesting corollary. Not a particularly old doctrine, by the way. It's fairly recent, this notion of the rapture. Some people think that there's going to be a lot of, what they call trials and tribulations before that, like, all sorts of things going badly, world wars, cataclysms. Others, like William Miller, thought that it was going to happen really soon. So their belief is the second coming of Jesus is going to come prior to the millennium. And William Miller, we're talking about the 1840s here. William Miller starts making predictions. And he is looking at the apocalyptic books. Books of the Bible. So that would be like, Book of Revelations, Book of Daniel. There's other apocalyptic literature as well. Actually, a lot of the apocalyptic literature didn't make it into the final cut of the Bible, which is interesting to see. There's a whole story there. But when people start reading these books in particular, it's not like reading the Gospels and looking at the Sermon on the Mount and trying to figure out, well, how angry can I get with my brother? Christians have differed about that. It's more like, well, what does the beast represent? Or what are the 7 seals? Or what is this supposed to be? And then people start making all sorts of correlations and predictions with this apocalyptic literature. And they're notoriously difficult to understand and interpret. but people make a shot at it anyway. William Miller figured he'd crack the code. And he started making predictions about when the coming of Jesus Christ was going to happen. And, for the Christians, if you actually do know the time when Christ is supposed to show up, then you should really just focus on that. And a lot of these people sold their homes, sold their farms, sold all their implements, sold their extra clothes, gave all that stuff away, gave it to the poor, because they thought that it was going to happen. And your book mentions a few dates. March 1843, October 1844 was what they call the Great Disappointment. Most of his followers left after that point. And it was actually not a public health, but what do you call it? Sort of like a public order problem, because so many people in some of these areas had sold off all of their goods, and you couldn't recover them. Now, most of the Adventists ended up leaving. Here's where the story gets even more interesting. This lady, Ellen G. White, she has what she describes as visions. She also writes a lot of books. You can actually find her books pretty easily in used bookstores because they've been printed in millions of copies. And she wrote anywhere from, estimates vary, somewhere around 30 to 40 books. And these are thick books. She was a follower of Miller, and she marries a minister and writer. She said that she had visions over her lifetime, and your book talks a little bit about the origin of this. I'm going to actually skip over that because that's getting into a little bit of religious psychology. And what happens is that White attracts a lot of followers. She's got charisma. She begins to teach. She adds a number of new emphases and refinements. If you're having visions, you can say, well, I had a vision about this, or I had a vision about that. And what we get coming out of her stuff and the people around her is what we call the Seventh Day Adventists. They are one of the main groups of Adventists that survive. They actually are a big church here in the United States. They operate, by the way, the third largest school system, religious school system in the United States, just behind the Catholics and the Lutherans. They run a lot of hospitals. For a group that believes, there's sort of a running joke in religious studies, for a group that believes that the end is near, they certainly do spend a lot of time on infrastructure, on building things that you're going to need if the end isn't near right now. And they focused a lot on some other things that had a role, not just in American religion, but in American culture in general. How many of you ate breakfast today? That few? That's kind of unfortunate. Some of you look like you're a bit confused. How many of you had breakfast cereal? Only one? One or two? How many of you eat breakfast cereal? You know where that came from originally? The Adventists. Kellogg, the guy who got Kellogg started, was a Seventh Day Adventist. And the Adventists focused very much on bodily purity. They felt that eating a diet full of meat wasn't good for you. They also thought you shouldn't drink and smoke and things like that as well. Breakfast cereal gets started as a way to have healthy grains, nuts, fruit, that sort of thing. Like your book points out, Ellen G. White probably would not be for Cocoa Puffs or Lucky Charms or things like that. I particularly like blueberry because those marshmallows and it turns the milk blue and stuff like that. But she wouldn't be for that because it's full of sugar and marshmallows. That's not good for you. But think about like cornflakes or Total or Raisin Bran. All those are Special K, right? Special K is supposed to be very healthy. All of those are coming out of this way of life that the Adventists are living. Your book also talks very quickly about these Utopian communities. So I'll just put the term down here. Most of these are very short-lived. The two exceptions would be the Oneida community and the Shakers. Both of which have very interesting orientations towards sexuality. The Shakers have died out in large part because they viewed sexuality as fundamentally bad, as sinful. And so they lived together in basically monastic communities, men and women. They were very egalitarian when it came to respect to relations between men and women, but there was supposed to be no sex. They were called Shakers because they would engage in this dance that talks about ecstatic dance, where they would actually shake during the dance. They've died out, but their furniture still remains. And if you get your hands on it, it's quite good. The Oneida community was a little bit different. It was started by this guy who claimed that he was sinless and anybody else could be sinless. And it was sort of a commune. They actually had to move one time because of their practice of complex marriage. Complex marriage means that it's not just that marriage is complicated by itself, which it is, but a lot of different partners they would connect up in sort of planned ways, particularly through this carefully regulated reproduction that they called stirpiculture. And so that didn't endear them to some of the locals, and they had to move. Eventually they settled down in Oneida. And they survived for a couple generations, but then they died out. The Utopian communities don't tend to last a very long time in the United States. And the Utopians are kind of connected with this whole broad theme. Your book is weaving together three different stories here. The Restorationists, the Adventists, and these Utopian communities. They're all three very different ways of living out and starting a new direction in the Christian life in America. And they're all indigenously American. They all begin here. As opposed to Lutherans who came over from Germany, Catholics who came over from all over the place, Presbyterians who came over from Scotland. These are new American religions. So that's where we'll leave off.